So in this scenario, if you'll remember, we check raise the flop and then bet the turn, and then we overbet the river. This is against a weaker player. Against a better player, I think it makes more sense to check this river, actually. Because, it'll depend. It makes more sense to check than it would to check against a weaker player. Maybe betting is still the best play. But against a better player, the reason for checking would be that if he has a hand like 9-5 suited, or any two pair really, he's going to bet himself when you check to him. Very few players, or good players, are going to be checking back 9-5 suited in the spot, nor should they against the majority of players, because they're going to work under the assumption that if you had a hand better than 9-5 suited, you just bet it yourself, which is usually going to be a very safe assumption. So they're going to assume maybe you backdoored into a king, maybe you have like Jack 10 or Jack 8, or some sort of Queen Jack, or you were doing something thin on the turn with like Ace 9, etc. And they're just going to think their hand is good, and they'll value bet. So you can just check raise them. And in fact, when you overbet, they might find some hero folds, if they have like a 7-5 or even like a 9-5 or like a Jack 10 or something, which again is a tweener hand that probably wouldn't matter what you did against. But if they have those hands, they might find folds with those because it'll look very strong if you overbet. So just to illustrate that, it's going to depend on whether you're playing a weaker player or a better player, and that a spot that's great to overbet as a bluff against a weaker player is going to be pretty bad against a better player, and vice versa. So let's move on to the last hand that I have. Okay, and in this hand, this is an illustration of a spot early on in a match against a regular, where the button, where I think you can get away with a lot and can overbet bluff in a spot that looks like you shouldn't be bluffing very often, and therefore will get a lot of respect from it. And in this scenario, assume that he has Ace 5, I believe. That your opponent has Ace 5. So we see bet the flop, and then we bet this turn, which I don't think is a good play unless you're intending to bet the river very often, because it's very unlikely that whatever your opponent check called the flop with is going to be folding on this turn. So even though you do have the flush, I think you should check back this turn unless you intend on barreling the river. Or the flush draw. So we river a pair of 4s, which again is very unlikely to be the best hand. And it just looks so stupid for us to overbet, to be bluffing in this spot, let alone overbet bluffing. So I think that you can get away with making your opponent fold an ace here a lot of the time if you decide to overbet bluff. Because it just really, against a good player, I don't think it looks very bluffy. And that's all it comes down to. It's not a spot that most people have seen others bluff in, especially better players, and therefore they've just been conditioned to fold a pretty strong range here against an overbet. And again, this is early on when you're getting credit. If your opponent picks up on these tendencies that you have, then it certainly becomes a lot less profitable to be overbet bluffing. So to sum up, really, I would say that against a weaker player, your best strategy will probably be to overbet bluff a couple times early on in the match when it's clear that they don't have a strong hand, which is often going to be kind of telegraphed to you. And you can just get away with overbet bluffing even when you don't represent anything against a weaker player, because they're not going to be thinking about what you represent and trying to piece the hand together. They're just going to be seeing that they have middle pair or something worse, and that you make a big bet on the river, and then they'll fold. So I think you can get away with a lot, maybe 2-3 times at most, I'd say. Overbet bluffing against a weaker player early on. I definitely wouldn't go beyond that. And then just completely do a 180 and just start overbetting for value all over the place, and they're not going to adjust too much. And against better players, I would also start overbet bluffing, but then it becomes a leveling war. You can't just do a 180 like you would against weaker players and only start overbetting for value, because a better player is going to pick up on that pretty fast. So it just becomes a leveling war of spots like the 7-4 suited, where you have to decide what level your opponent's on. Is he going to be thinking that it's such a bad spot to bluff, therefore you won't bluff? Or is he going to be thinking that it's such a bad spot to bluff, therefore he thinks that you think that he thinks you won't be bluffing, if that made any sense. I don't know if it did. So you just have to try and play the leveling game later on, but I think against a better player, you can still get away with a lot overbetting early with air. In spots that are different than against weaker players. For instance, again, just to reiterate the contrast in between a better player and a weaker player, this would be a good spot to overbet for value against a weaker player because you don't expect them to fold an ace, and you'd expect them to probably fold anything weaker than an ace, regardless of what you bet. But against a better player, it's a good spot to overbet with air and a bad spot to overbet for value early on.